This is actually a sort of internal effort at Spotify. Uh, it's a practice that they call, or program, whatever your word you want to use, like perfect fit content. So there's like a team internally at Spotify that is dedicated to looking over certain types of playlists that are these sort of like background playlists, mood playlists, and there's a specific set of licensors that are these production companies. So Firefly, Epidemic Sound, but then a list of others too that provide this music to them at a lower cost, or as they describe it, with improved margins. So a better cost for them.
What's going on? Welcome to the New Music Business. I'm your host, Ari Herstand, author of How to Make It in the New Music Business, the book. Third edition is out now everywhere, all formats, hardcover, ebook, audiobook, however you like to consume books, you can find my book. Today, my guest is another author, Liz Pelly. She wrote the new book, Mood Machine, The Rise of Spotify and the Costs of the Perfect Playlist. I read this book. It's a fantastic book. I definitely encourage you to read it if you want to learn about the inner workings of Spotify. This is not a how-to book. This actually pulls the curtain back on how Spotify, kind of the inner workings, how they influence playlists, how they influence listener behavior, how they were able to launch by striking these deals with major labels, giving them equity in the company, which is well documented, giving them fat advances that they did not have to pass down to their artists. A lot of frustrating stuff. I was quite infuriated at reading a lot of this book, just at how unfair the whole system is and how it's structured that way. And specifically, we talk a lot about, and this, she's gotten a lot of press on this topic, and this was in her Harper's article, which if you're not ready to read a full book, I definitely encourage you to read the Harper's article all about the fake artist controversy. She calls them ghost artists, and she illuminates, which is the first time that anyone has ever talked about this program because it is under strict confidentiality at Spotify, called Perfect Fit Content, or PFC, and she profiles and illuminates the whole program in her Harper's article as well as in the book. This is the program where there are fake artists, and a lot of the most popular playlists on Spotify for passive listening, we're talking study playlists, ambient music, lo-fi beats, jazz in the background, jazz over dinner, peaceful piano, peaceful guitar, all that stuff, all of those playlists that I'm sure you've seen. If you click through, you see that these aren't actual real artist projects. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these monikers that people have called them fake artists, but really they are stock music that has been licensed to Spotify at a much lower rate. And she talks all about this program, and she conducted tons of interviews for this book, and the first time I've ever heard former Spotify employees on record really illuminating how this practice works, and with all the various terms and the pressure campaign that Spotify senior staff would put on their editors to include some of this lower cost music, this PFC content. So I'll let her talk more about this. It's a fascinating interview, and we cover a lot of various topics and just kind of the value of music we get into, and how that differs between maybe how individuals value music and our favorite records, and how Spotify values music and why that's different. So really fascinating conversation. I think you're going to really dig this, and then go check out the book. Should also mention, she's a journalist. She's a music journalist. She has written for NPR and The Guardian and Pitchfork and many other publications over the years. So you can find her new book, Mood Machine, anywhere you find books. And you can find all of us that make the show happen at Ari's Take on the socials. You can find me at Ari Herstand on Instagram. But right now, if you wouldn't mind just pausing this, leave us a 5-star review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Give us a thumbs up on YouTube. Leave us a comment on Spotify or YouTube, or however you're listening to this. Leave us a comment. And visit aristake.com. Get on the email list. That's the best way to stay in touch with us. Get on the email list. We'll send you important info about the new music business on the email list. All right, let's kick into the show. Liz, Pelly, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Of course. So first off, congratulations on Mood Machine. I have the book here. Incredible book. If there's any doubt that I read it and consumed it, I've highlighted stuff on virtually every page of this book, and it's honestly the most comprehensive investigative report on Spotify I've ever read. I think probably in existence. So thank you for writing this, and thank you for bringing to light so much of the inner workings and the beginnings, and just the platform that has dominated our music industry for the better part of 10, 15 years.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the close reading of the book, too. I appreciate it.
Of course. So first off, what inspired you to write this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I started writing about Spotify in 2016. That's when I first started
Mm-hmm.
working on my first article about Spotify. It came out in 2017. Uh, that's something that I've been, pointing back to in interviews a lot. And I like to point out that I didn't necessarily spend a whole year writing that first article. It's just that I was a freelance journalist with a lot of other jobs and things going on. So I started working on it in 2016. It came out in 2017. And that was a piece
Mm-hmm.
about the influence of major labels on Spotify playlists. And whenever anyone asks me this question of, what inspired you to write this book, I feel like there's almost two answers. One is why, the reason to start researching Spotify to begin with back in 2016. And then it's this question of like, what inspires you to write something? And then what motivates you to keep writing about it?
Yeah,
Because as a journalist, you cover lots of different topics and don't always feel motivated to stick with something for so long. So back in 2016, there were a few things going on. One was that I'm someone who has always sort of had one foot in the music journalism world and then one foot just in the world of participating in independent music scenes. Like I also have a background as a DIY show booker and helping run various music venues. And I feel like at the time I was just surrounded by musicians and heard a lot of them often talking about the way that the digital music ecosystem was changing and various, um, gripes with it, which was pretty different because I actually am someone who uh, I, came up on the world of like MySpace, LiveJournal, Tumblr, internet
sure.
music has always been something that has been interesting to me. And it's also
Mm-hmm.
something that when I was younger, like in high school and college, I think I saw a lot of really interesting potential and excitement in ways in which the internet, could be provide alternatives to the mainstream music industry and alternative networks and ways of finding and discovering and sharing and talking about music. Um,
Sure.
so one thing was kind of seeing the way that independent music communities were responding to the increasingly dominant digital music platforms. Another was just, being a music journalist myself, I feel like there was a degree to which I had just kind of to some extent kind of grown bored with the sort of things that you can do as a music journalist, interview
Mm-hmm.
bands about their upcoming record, write album reviews, write a blurb for a list for an
Sure.
online publication. And there was actually
Yeah.
a distinct moment where I remember kind of, sitting down with my story list, as a freelancer, basically since the moment I went full-time freelance in 2013, I've had the same spreadsheet where I keep track of ideas for stories that I might want to write. And I made a list of 3 story ideas that were sort of like music journalism, but also kind of more investigative because it was just something that was exciting to me to try to do. Um,
Yeah.
and one of them was Spotify playlists because, they seem to be this sort of mysterious thing that I always heard people talking about, but didn't really know a lot about how they worked. And I I also had a friend who was working in the music industry at the time, at a major label, who, kind of told me a little bit about the different ways in which major labels were sort of trying to use different tactics to influence like visual real estate on streaming services. So, and that shaped the trajectory of the first story that I wrote, which ended up being about kind of like Filter and Digster and Topsify and all those major label playlist brands.
Mm-hmm.
So then to get to the third thing that influenced me to write the book, or to research Spotify in general, was I read this book in 2015 called The People's Platform by Asher Taylor, which is sort of a book that does this really big picture look at the ways, the kind of mythology that the internet was going to be a democratizing force for culture. And it's kind of this sort of like wholesale look at how, issues of media consolidation and corporate influence had come to influence the internet, and kind of how, untrue that whole original myth of the democratizing promise of the internet had come to be. So that's kind of like a roundabout answer to what the initial, not roundabout,
Yeah.
kind of long, extensive answer. But those are some of the things that initially got me interested in the subject.
No, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, that frames the book. I mean, it's clear like there's a lot of allusions and references that you make to those concepts, and from playlist to the myth of democratization and all of that. So I appreciate that you approached this topic over the years, but especially within the book from I guess through a DIY lens, with that DIY foundation and kind of independent mindedly, being very aware of the independent music industry. And I think that's something that it has not been as apparent, or is kind of been a blind spot for a lot of music industry journalists. This was one of the few things that I've read that really has covered this topic through that lens. And so I appreciate that you kind of brought it through that lens. I want to specifically talk about. Let's start off. There's a lot that I want to cover with this. There's so much great info in this book. Talk to me about Ghost Artists and the PFC program. What is it? Let's break it down.
Okay, yeah. Well, before I dive into that, just to like respond to one thing that you just said too, I feel
Yes.
like definitely like one of the goals for the book was to offer an independent music perspective on the story of streaming, because I do feel like there are different, you know, instances of the story being told over the years that were, really helpful. But I do feel like it was important for me that, like, for example, that there be a moment in the book that specifically chronicled like the moment when independent labels sort of got on board with the Spotify model, and like what was going on in independent music, the independent music industry and culture at the time. And also it's really important to talk to a lot of independent musicians, because I definitely know that in music business reporting, like not even just independent musicians, like musicians in general, I feel like voices often don't get included in music business reporting. That said, what I really wanted to point out is that a lot of those music business reporters who do that sort of daily, like day in and day out reporting on the ins and outs of like what's going on in the industry, like I'm also super grateful for, because a lot of their work was really instrumental in putting this book together too, and just having the source material. Like, if you look through the end notes of this book, there's so many just sort of like Music Business Worldwide, Music Ally, Billboard articles that are cited in the end notes. So it gave me a renewed sense of appreciation for all of that work as well. And I just wanted to point that out.
For sure. And yeah, there has been a tide shift. I mean, you've been part of that movement, but I think just because, just just from the economic standpoint of it all, the indies have commanded a larger market share of the global recorded music industry. And, the numbers fluctuate a little bit depending on, what reports you're looking at. But it's safe to say it's around 35% of the global music revenue is commanded by the independent labels, self-releasing artists, all of that. So, it just would not be our journalists would not be doing their due diligence if they kept ignoring the independent sector of the music industry.
Yeah, I totally agree with that for sure.
So anyway,
we can get into too, like later on in the conversation, is just how the concept of independent music or the concept of independent music too has become like so it's such like a wide ranging umbrella now when you use
yeah.
that phrase. But anyway,
I know, and we will definitely. I mean, we could get into that's a whole other topic. Considering, it's just been announced that Virgin just bought Downtown Music, which owns CD Baby, and there's just been more of that consolidation when Sony bought AWOL, which you reference in the book. The famously AWOL stood for Artists Without a Label. Now it's owned by Sony. So there's a lot of that, and then like what constitutes truly independent versus major label, where's the market share even delineated? So, but yeah, we don't need to get into that right now. But I do want to, so I want to ask you, talk to me about ghost artists and the PFC model. I've never heard of the PFC model before. You put it in your Harper's piece and then more extensively in the book. And to just lay the groundwork, and I'll let you fully explain it, but there's been rumors about this kind of fake artist concept over the years. Music Business Worldwide as early as maybe 2017 was talking about it. I mean, a lot of people were talking about it, but Spotify never really, they always danced around it or flat out denied that they had any participation or anything to do with this quote unquote fake artist phenomenon. So break it down for us. What is it? And then tell me, just fake artists, ghost artists, and the PFC program.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting. So many people have wanted to talk about this. And I think the fact that it is of such wide interest to so many readers definitely speaks to how it seems to like struck a nerve with people. And, there seems to be a lot of concern about this. So like you mentioned, as early as 2016, 2017, there were whispers in the music business trade press. Spotify is, supposedly filling its own playlists with fake artists. In fact, some of the early articles even said Spotify is creating fake artists to fill out its lean back playlists for sleeping, studying, focusing, chill out music, etc., functional genres. And this is having a big impact on musicians in the classical, jazz, ambient, and lo-fi hip hop beat making spaces. And as those early stories in the music business trade press, trickled out, Spotify was really quick to firmly, deny that they were creating these artists. But didn't necessarily deny that there was some sort of broader arrangement. So for a while, music business writers, people in the music industry, and also, curious Spotify users on social media have been speculating about this and asking a lot of questions, pulling up pages of artists that didn't seem to be real. Like every few years, you would see like a viral post on social media from someone saying something along the lines of, hey, I was listening to this focus playlist on Spotify and I just started looking at the artists and, they all seem to have this weird AI generated artwork and they're all attributed to these stock music companies like Epidemic Sound, a Swedish production music company. And I can't find any information about any of these artists on social media anywhere. Like, what's going on? Like, these artists are all fake, sort of thing. And as I write in the book, actually, basically, as soon as the first article that I wrote about Spotify came out in 2017, the one about Filter and Digster and Topsify and the major label influence on Spotify playlists, someone emailed me right away when that article came out and said, "Great piece! Like, you should research the fake artists next." basically, since I started writing about this subject, people have been asking questions about it. And it was never, um, in some ways, it was never super interesting to me just because I sort of assumed that these were just like DIY hustlers trying to game the system, and or that maybe it was just, Epidemic Sound puts their music on Spotify and they're in Sweden, and some of these curators are in Sweden, so maybe they just know the people at Epidemic Sound. Like I didn't necessarily, it didn't seem super like nefarious to me or anything, even if it's like unfortunate. But as I started, uh, well, actually, one other thing I should say is that in 2022, there was a bunch of reporting that came out of Sweden on the subject in the daily newspaper there, DN, where they had sort of pieced together some copyright documents. They were able to access some documents through one of the collection societies, and they were able to prove that there were these hundreds of tracks released under hundreds of monikers that were all attributed to this really small handful of Swedish songwriters that were connected to this company called Firefly Entertainment, which is another one of those companies that I think for a really long time was really mysterious to a lot of people who are really tuned into this discourse. Like, okay, we know what Epidemic Sound is. Epidemic Sound, like, is a billion-dollar production music company that anyone can subscribe to, basically, to have access to a royalty-free production music library. But another one of these companies that would always pop up in the label line on some of these what seemed to be so-called fake artists was Firefly Entertainment, this seemingly small company out in Sweden, and no one really, even some of the musicians that I spoke to who were sort of making music in genres affected by these practices, were like, Firefly Entertainment was always really mysterious to a lot of us because we didn't know anyone who was involved with it. And we knew some people who made music for Epidemic, but we didn't know anyone who made music for Firefly.
Yeah.
So the DN reporting on Firefly and this, connection between Firefly's founder and this senior Spotify executive, and proving that there might be some sort of connection there was really helpful and kind of pushing the story along. And Music Business Worldwide always kept like reporting on it too, like story along. But when I started working on my book, it was sort of one of the things about writing the book that was kind of like in some ways, satisfying, is that like while writing essays about this company and like, features mostly these sort of like, long form reported essay type pieces. I would also like have conversations like this one with people, about the writing that I was doing or conferences, and people would ask questions. And so a lot of times I didn't know the answers to them. And I would say, great question. Yeah, I'm not really sure. I've never researched that. And the book gave me an opportunity to finally like dig into some of the stuff that I hadn't had the, time or resources to dig into before. And this was definitely one of those things that I knew I was going to have to try to be able to, answer in some way, or they're not fully, like there's still questions that I have about the practice and about the program internally in Spotify. But yeah, so once I started interviewing musicians and former Spotify employees and people who worked in the music business at the time, it was actually, really surprising to me to learn through all the reporting that this is actually a sort of internal effort at Spotify. It's a practice that they call, or program, whatever your word you want to use, like perfect fit content. So there's like a team internally at Spotify that is dedicated to looking over certain types of playlists that are these sort of like background playlists, mood playlists, and there's a specific set of licensors that are these production companies, so Firefly, Epidemic Sound, but then a list of others too that provide this music to them at a lower cost, or as they describe it, with improved margins. So, a better cost for them. And
Right.
then the production companies in turn, commission licensed music. So they commission the musicians to make the tracks. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so something that was really interesting in reporting this out was actually talking to some of the musicians who make music for some of these production companies that in turn have these this sort of special type of contract with Spotify that
Right.
allows their music to be designated PFC, which in turn, like Spotify, like on the record, in their responses to Harper's, said, like we don't guarantee anyone playlist placement. But it was pretty clear from the reporting that I did that there were instances of, senior staff members saying to playlist editors, like new batch of songs from XYZ licensor, like make sure that you check it out and get this stuff added to your playlist. So like,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe not make sure you get this added to your playlist, but like, make sure that you give this attention sort of thing.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
because to their credit, I don't think that I ever saw instances of like you have to add this to your playlist or anything like.
Yeah. No, it was a pressure campaign, and I have the quote right there that one of the senior staff members said, "Please prioritize adding from these, as in kind of these new this new partner." As this, yeah, please from this list, as this is a new partner, so they can get some live feedback. So they did say, please prioritize this, and so it's like straight up, it was like, and if you're an editor there and you hear this from your boss, I mean, what are you gonna do? You're gonna prioritize it. You're gonna put it in there. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Okay, I'm glad you have it pulled up right in front of you. So
Yeah.
um, uh, yeah, so that was interesting, and it was it was an interesting thing to uncover, and it's interesting seeing how much it's struck a nerve with people. I feel like there's a lot of reasons for it, but we can get.
Yeah. No. So just to step back a little bit and help people understand this if they have not been following this and just don't really have any framework for it, and just to understand, because I think at the core of all of this, and the reason that Spotify was prioritizing this cheaper content, this stock music content, is because there is no set royalty rate that Spotify is paying for a single stream. We've heard, people like to say, oh, it's 0.0035 of a dollar is what you get paid per stream. That's not true. And maybe if you could just break down how Spotify payments work, and just the overall nature of Spotify payments, and then how it relates to this topic of PFC and why Spotify would want to prioritize PFC content.
Yeah, it's so complicated, right?
I know. Sorry, I can help, but I'd love to hear just from what you learned, and I know your brain is probably swirling and I do want to talk about how like the major label component to all of this, and how the deals that they struck initially and all of that. Feel free to tap into that now, or we can get into that later. But it is so complicated. There is not one streaming royalty rate, but the simplest way, maybe starting with like, what is the pro rata system? Just kind of how more or less does Spotify calculate royalties, and then how it relates to PFC for now.
Yeah, for sure. So I feel like the easiest way of understanding it is that artists don't get paid based on number of streams necessarily, or a per stream rate, but they get paid based on this really complicated revenue share model called pro rata, where the rights holder through which you've licensed your music to Spotify, collects a chunk of the royalty pool, sort of on your behalf, and it's based on stream share. So that's like the internal word that is used to describe market share, essentially. So, for example, like if a certain major label if their whole catalog that's on a streaming service in a given payment period made up 20% of the streams on Spotify, then they would get 20% of the eligible royalty pool.
Right.
There's all of these other factors that affect, how a stream is weighted in the stream share model. The major labels have, various like per user guaranteed payments on the free tier. So there's kind of like there's different factors depending on what market the stream happened in, what type of plan, whether it's like a free plan, a premium plan, a family plan. And then, yeah, there's all these different factors that contribute to how it's weighted, how much the stream is worth, like in the equation. But it's really like this revenue share model. So there's, on the parts of the majors, different, maybe different rights holders. There's an incentive to want to grow your stream share, and then maybe on Spotify's, and there's also an incentive to want to try to grow the stream share of music that costs them less to license. That's my guess. I would frame it as.
Of course.
But even if this music is only taking up like a small percentage of stream share, it's still like when you think about the total stream share of a company like Spotify, it's still a significant savings.
Yeah.
So I think that might be one way of explaining.
Right, and just to kind of illustrate this a little bit further, as it relates to kind of this PFC model, and so some of these playlists that Spotify would consider background listening. So we're talking kind of like dinner jazz or peaceful piano, or there's like study playlists, and this kind of functional playlist that people pop on in the background or something like that. Previously, these would be populated with real musicians releasing as like it was created, real artist projects releasing their own music on their own, or maybe through a DIY distributor or through a label, and or maybe even they're legendary musicians on some of these jazz playlists. There's a cultural and a background and an understanding and the foundation of what this music is, and Spotify's paying the full rate for those songs. And in turn, a lot of these artists, like one of them, this acoustic guitar player that you highlighted in the book, Lance Allen, who was included in a lot of these playlists and was making a very good living because of this. Now, nobody really knew his name, but because he was populated in a lot of these playlists, he was making a lot of money because a lot of people were putting this on, and he was just getting streamed over and over and over again. Now, these playlists account for probably billions of streams on Spotify. And so if you replace all of them with this lower cost music from these production companies like Epidemic or Firefly or all these other partners, then Spotify theoretically can, and this is actually a question for you, and I couldn't find the answer in the book, and I'm wondering if you know this answer. Theoretically, Spotify would pocket the savings of what they are not paying for the full rate. Now, is that correct? Or because I was always under the assumption, and this is kind of what turned my brain upside down, was Spotify has always said we pay out about 70% of the money that we get from the money that we take in, we pay about 70% out to rights holders. So in my mind, if they're paying less for these streams, well, that money is still going out to the music industry. It's just getting redistributed, and it's not actually being pocketed by Spotify. Or is that wrong? Is they are actually pocketing that money, and now they're making more than 30%? Does that make sense? I don't know the answer to that, and I was curious if you did.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that question either. It's not something that I have like a clear answer on. All I can really do is like speculate,
Sure.
because I know that, sources that I interviewed said that this is a arrangement that was financially beneficial for the company. It's
Okay.
referred to as a program that's like music licensed to us with improved margins. So it's obvious that this is a program through which the
Spotify.
company is saving money.
Yeah.
So I can only speculate that the answer where they're taking money and putting it in their pocket would seem to be true, but I can't
Yeah. That's the most reasonable, and you're right, and the reason that they're prioritizing that so much as a company, that's the only, to me, reasonable explanation. It's not that they're being redistributing that money, because that doesn't make as much sense. Considering now, considering the biggest providers of this royalty free music are not owned by the major labels. So that was my next question, because if they were owned by the major labels, we could talk a whole conspiracy of just like, well, they're redistributing this money now to them because of it or whatever. But Epidemic and Firefly are independent, and all these other independent royalty-free stock music companies. So when they now, what did do you have any indication of what the major labels feel about this PFC program? Because theoretically, it's hurting them too. If their songs are not being populated in these playlists, that market share is being diverted away from majors theoretically to these stock music companies.
That's a great question. And I also don't know the answer to that question.
Okay, all good.
Super curious to know. I mean, I just I would find it hard to believe that they wouldn't know that this is going on just
Yeah.
because of the sort of revolving door that exists between streaming companies and major labels.
Hmm.
I would find it hard to believe that they didn't know what was going on. And, I can't confidently say that other streaming services are engaged in this practice, but there do seem to be some signs that they are based on, like I mentioned, some of the companies that I researched that were listed as PFC providers also indicate that they, service their music to other streaming services as well. And
Hmm.
it does seem that there is something similar happening with at least with some of the other major streaming services. Definitely
Okay.
topic for further research. And so just given the nature of it as kind of a widespread practice, it seems I'd be really surprised if they didn't know about it, but
Right.
I haven't personally heard from.
Yeah, let's talk about the cozy relationship of the major labels and Spotify. Can you just break down how Spotify was able to launch in the US?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I know how they were able to, launch in general, I mean, what I,
With the licensing, I mean, more specifically with the major labels. Yeah.
yeah. I don't really actually specifically cover the story of the negotiation of the license. I know that it was very hard. I know that it was really hard for the majors to launch in. I know it's hard for Spotify to launch in the United States, but and it took a few more years because of what I do know is that when Spotify launched in Sweden, it was at a time where the majors would have been really hesitant to license something like Spotify
Right.
because of the aversion to anything that was advertising free music, and that was the original business model of Spotify. It was free plus ads. um, and they were only really willing to take a risk on something like that in a country like Sweden, where the music business, according to some people I talked to, had sort of given up on the idea that people in Sweden were ever going to buy music anyway.
Hmm.
And, some people I interviewed said that the music industry had started calling Sweden a lost market. So it
Right.
was maybe they were a little bit more willing to experiment with something like a free tier. And and then it was through the negotiation with the majors that they came up with the idea for like the subscription tier as well.
Mm.
Um, uh, but yeah, and then it was a few 3 years later that it took 3 more years until they were able to launch in the United States. And I do know that it was like quite contentious negotiations, and that at least like one of the contracts wasn't signed until like the night before the product launched in the United States.
Yeah. Well, I'm more specific. I guess I'm getting at. Can you speak to the advances that Spotify paid the majors, or some of the kickbacks that Spotify gave the majors, and the royalty rates? And you referenced kind of these minimum payments based on the free tiers. I guess all of that. Whether I don't, maybe I'm hazy on if it was for the U.S. or the initial negotiations. Which to me, it's I let me reframe this. Uh, One of the most infuriating parts of reading your book was learning that the major labels were getting preferential treatment from Spotify. And that was baked into the initial contracts. And to learn that independents were being paid less per stream than major labels. Maybe you can speak to that concept a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, it's super interesting because, like, even in my book, when I talk about the details of the major labels' initial deals with Spotify, I'm drawing on the 2015 Sony contract leak,
That was
which
leaked, right?
it's kind of like a classic document. I feel like if you
Hmm.
are interested in like streaming discourse, it's kind of in some ways like the best look that exists into like that early um, what an early streaming contract would have looked like, and
Yeah.
surely have changed since then. But so yeah, in those early contracts, those early license deals that were signed, the major labels got advances, equity. They got guaranteed minimum payments on the free tier per user. Um, and a lot of the other sort of like characterization of what the early deals, would have looked like, and some of the contextualizing of them that I do came from looking at the music business trade press from around the time.
Hmm.
So even early on, like in 2009, 2010, there would constantly be articles in the music business trade press about, how people in the music industry were feeling about this preferential treatment that the major labels had gotten, or independent labels starting to ask questions about why they were getting paid like royalty rates that were either rumored to be or proven to be less than the majors. So a lot of the way in which that is set up in the book was really just from like digging into the music press archives and seeing like what people were saying at the
Sure.
time.
Yeah.
Which is that like from the very beginning, like something that I write in pretty early on in the book is that it really didn't take long for independent labels and independent artists to start asking hard questions of the model, and to realize that maybe saving the music industry wasn't necessarily the same thing as saving music.
Mm.
Or that situation that returns the major labels to growth, that like returns a lot of value to the major labels, like isn't necessarily the same thing as a system set up to figure out ways to adequately value the work of an independent musician or
Hmm.
independent record label catalogs.
Yeah. Right. And I mean, let's talk about the value of music a little bit, because that was another big takeaway that I got, uh, was that how we have valued music, how just as a society and as a people, or maybe as individuals, how we value our favorite pieces of music or our favorite albums is dramatically very different than how Spotify is valuing music. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, totally. Or even just different from how, the music industry values music, I'd
Sure.
say. Or yeah, it's interesting. Like the concept of value is so different to different people. So like you could talk about the financial value of music, you could talk about the social value of music, or the cultural value, or the artistic value of music.
Yeah.
But like just specifically talk about the financial value of music, I suppose. Um, Something that I sort of trace in the book a little bit, and this is kind of, I think, a conversation that is really like played out over the past 10 years when you think about like um, criticisms of the streaming model.
Hmm.
I think that it can be really instructive to like really interrogate the concept of the per stream valuation of music
Yes.
and what that means and how that distorts our concept of music and music's
Hmm.
value. Because the per stream valuation of music is something that is really, comes with a lot of like ideas about what type of music has value, or, what type of music uh, is, worthy of fair compensation, just to speak broadly.
Sure.
Um, I think something that comes up a lot in my book, I got the opportunity to interview actually like one of my favorite musicians and someone who I have a lot of respect for, and I'm very grateful that I was able to speak with, is Anoni, who there's this great quote in the book that I took from our conversation where Anoni is sort of just reflecting on kind of like what a sort of like I think she refers to it as like an astute political maneuver to take music out of to astute political maneuver to move from the
I
concept
have
of
it. It is a very, very politically astute maneuver that favors a narcotic relationship to music over a complex meditative relationship to music.
yeah, like I think that especially for a lot of people who are into independent music or like just not pop music, maybe music that not even like more challenging or artistic, but just not the kind of music that you would want to like keep on in the background all day while
Hmm.
you're at
Hmm.
work. Um, you know, Value just comes differently. Like you
Yeah.
might go to a show and see a band and it really moves you and you have a profound experience. So at the end of the show, you're like, I want to give these people $20 so that they have money for gas to get to the next place they're going. And so
Right.
that they like, leave this show feeling like, we can keep doing what we're doing. And you might buy that record from them for $20 and like listen to it like twice. But
Right.
that doesn't mean that it doesn't have value to you. It might still be an important part of your record collection because it holds a memory. Maybe a couple of years later, you'll be like flipping through your record collection and come across it and remember that experience and play it, and it'll take you back to a moment in time. Like that is
Hmm.
valuable. But
Yes.
in that whole scenario that I just played out, you maybe, uh, that's maybe like 30 plays, which
Right.
in a Spotify world would be like, less than $1 or something.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
it's just so much of what makes music valuable is really hard to like put a universal dollar amount on and say like
Yeah.
this is usually what the financial value of music is. Um, and I think that when you have like a system that rewards music on this per play basis. It just kind of, it's just set up to incentivize and reward certain types of music. And,
Yes.
for the most part, there's nothing wrong with the types of music that it's set up to incentivize and reward. Like, there's plenty of people that make really, really, like, beautiful, meaningful, or maybe ugly and meaningful, like, music that can be streamed on repeat in the backgrounds that maybe does really well in this environment. But I think that it's just, I it's good to just, be real about that, I guess.
Yeah, right. Not you're right about this. The best albums aren't always meant to be streamed a million times, but the value that the whole business model of Spotify is to get people to stream it would essentially just as the what every app or every platform is trying to do is get their users to stay on platform as long as possible. And it to them it doesn't matter if they're sitting if the listener is sitting in a dark room with a candle lit with headphones on and paying attention to every single note and every single word and like listening astutely to their favorite album of all time, or if it's on in the background at a party or while they're eating dinner or listening, or studying or whatever. To them it's all the same as long as they're on platform and they're staying there. And so it's like, you know to Spotify, and they have and I've had Spotify on the show, and I've asked them this as well, and it's just like they keep pushing the narrative that it is that the algorithm that the cream rises to the top. The best music will be found, and that they have no influence over the algorithm, because this almighty powerful algorithm rewards the quote unquote best content and the music that people are responding to the most. But you point out that algorithms, I think I have this quote somewhere, that it's they're not that they're not neutral. It's that an algorithm cannot be neutral, and that data is never neutral. I don't know if you want to speak to that a bit.
Yeah, yeah, I feel like that's a point that comes up in the book a couple times. And there's one time, like I think the quote that you just read is from Taza Sheik from the band Lorraine, which just to point out, like, it's like already quoted, like Anoni and Taja from
Hmm.
Lorraine, like musicians are like great sources of information about their experiences on these platforms. And I feel like it's just like, something that can't be repeated enough. I'm so grateful for all the musicians who shared their really sharp and smart perspectives through this book. But yeah, it's interesting because I think in the book I also described that idea, that concept that um, the stuff that gets popular in the platform era is just the best because users voted with their clicks, or users voted
Mm,
with their streams. I kind of talk about it as like a defining propaganda project of the Web 2 era, which I think it, like, it sort of is in some ways. All of these platforms, you know, incentivize certain types of behavior, and the type of behavior that is incentivized by their need for engagement, need for growth. These types of behaviors, reward certain types of material that tends to become popular. It's not just unique to streaming services, but on streaming, it's true that I always say that, like, uh, data that can be gleaned from streaming service isn't necessarily like pure data. It's data about Spotify. It's not data about music. And
right.
that doesn't mean it's not interesting. Like, you could figure out something interesting from that, but it's good to just like be honest about
Hmm.
what it is. It's data that's shaped by business practices. It's data that's shaped by what type of music gets rewarded in a certain platform environment. And oftentimes, on a platform like Spotify, there are really clear objectives to want to keep a user engaged, to extend session, keep people on the platform longer. That's why they look at things like how long did somebody stay on a certain playlist. Trying to they're trying to maximize the amount of time that you spend with a discovery product. Otherwise, the discovery product wouldn't exist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Right. And it's kind of like they value success based on replay value of these songs and of these artists. And and they value success of a playlist internally based on, like you said, how long people are staying on the platform. And they monitor that. And you highlight that a bit in the book, is just kind of how the playlist editors at Spotify, they have a tracker that basically kind of keeps track of all of the user behavior and the percentages of, or is like all of the various actions that the user's taking, and they can gauge whether the playlist is like quote unquote successful or not based on all of the actions, or if a song is resonating on that playlist or not based on, the user behavior, whether they save it to their own playlist, whether they hit skip, whether they, listen all the way through, all of those actions. Yeah. So and it's interesting. I mean, this is something that you reference is like, and you talked about, which I hadn't really thought of before, was how Spotify, it's not, let me try to find this. That the culture and community have suffered through this hyper personalization of the algorithm, and that it's, you said music recommendations as a means of creating silos, not connections, and kind of how the algorithms have gotten so personalized that it's not like we're all having this collective experience of listening to an album together, or even a playlist as it was early on, or something like that. It's just so hyper personalized, and how the user, though, doesn't have as much choice as they'd like to think, is that Spotify has been guiding and directing listener behavior. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that, like, to the first point about the silos versus connections,
Yeah.
I think that something that is really a good example of this would be something like the AI DJ. If you go and listen to the Spotify AI DJ, basically what you're being served is these little slices of different types of algorithmic recommendation systems. So, like, something that I think is really important is to always like emphasize, and probably when you had people from Spotify on your podcast, they've said this too, is like there's not really any like the algorithm on Spotify, and it's like, there's different types of data sources and different models and different products that draw on like different models based on different data sources. That's something that was interesting to learn over the years myself. And so with AI DJ, they're drawing on these different like recommendation models. So you might be listening to AI DJ, and the voice, which is, an AI generated voice trained on the voice of one of their employees. It will address you by name and, say like, all right, like, maybe it'll say, like, we're going to get started with some stuff that you've been listening to lately.
Right.
So you're totally drawing on your listening behavior, or might say, like, here's some songs you were listening to back in 2022. So again, it's about like the stuff that you've already been listening to. Next block might be, here's some stuff that was on your release radar last week. So again, it's like based on your listening patterns. It's, another sort of type of algorithmic recommendation system that they have. Then it might be like, okay, we're going to play some songs that you might like in the world of Metropolis. So like drawing on their algorithmic, their genre maps that they have.
Right.
And then it might be like, okay, now we're going to play some songs from our like indie chill playlist or whatever. So maybe that would be more of like a curated recommendation. But like
Yeah.
obviously they would play that for you unless like if you were someone who only like who never listens to a playlist like that before. So it's kind of like there are all these like different types of algorithmic recommendations. And what I mean about like silos versus connections is I listen to the radio like all day in my house. Like it's like one of my main ways of listening to music. I live in New York where we have incredible community radio stations like WKCR, WFMU, all these like legendary independent radio stations. And when you listen to a radio show, there's not a DJ like telling you about how this music relates to you or a
Right.
DJ like playing something that you listened to last week. The voice that you hear in between songs, it might be telling you like who's the artist you just listened to, what album is it from, what year was it made, where was it recorded, maybe some information about the players on the track, and maybe some of like the context of the album in that person's discography or something.
Yeah.
So if you think about like the ways in which music is contextualized on streaming, like when the context of music is all about how this relates to you, where this fits into your taste profile, which is the phrase that Spotify uses to talk about its kind of like datafied profile of your listening habits. When it's all about how each slice of recommendations relates to you and your taste profile, it is just so different from contextualizing music in a way that opens you up to the world of music and points you in new directions where you might like learn something about music or being introduced to a new musician or album or scene or moment in history that you didn't know about before.
Yeah.
And they're just it's something that I write in the book or that has come up in a lot of conversations is that like one of the things that I think like streaming culture and all this sort of like lean back listening, the distillation of music into pure vibes in the background is it really like complicates this idea of like what is music for? And obviously everyone will have different answers to that question, like, what music means to them, like why they listen to music, what they look to music for. But I think that, for a lot of people, it's for connection or because you want to like learn
Mm.
something about someone because you want to like expand your mind or you want to like not just because you want your own music taste and the stuff that you already listen to fed back to you. Sometimes that's nice. Like
Right.
sometimes like I love to like make a mix of all the songs that I liked listening to when I was in college and like go listen to them and be like
Sure.
transported to a moment in time. But most of the time like I want to be listening to either something that is um, new or something that someone that I like recommended to me or someone that I trust, like, is really excited about, or, something that a label that I really like has put out or a friend's really strong recommendation, that kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah, no, for sure. And yeah, and it's Spotify doesn't really seem interested in challenging their listener like that or opening them up to brand new things. And even to the point of crediting, like they don't have credits, which is just so frustrating to me. Even Apple Music has credits now by song. And I don't know if people realize this or know this, but it's been that you can click into any song in Apple Music or title, and even Amazon Music has this and Pandora has this, and you can read all the credits that everyone who played on the track, who mixed it, who mastered it, who produced it, all of that stuff, liner notes essentially that I always loved reading it with CDs and vinyl records, the liner notes, just like paying credit to that. Spotify doesn't have that because they don't have I always thought it was just out of laziness, but now to me it's kind of just like, well, it this is just not in line with their business model, and kind of bringing it all the way back around to kind of the PFC Ghost Artist thing. I was like, man, if they did have full credits in there, we would see that it's the same three people behind like 500 songs or something like that. And they, it's just, they're only really doing, like you said, what is good for kind of the Spotify culture. It's not music culture, it's Spotify culture.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. And I do know, like, at some point they added the ability to click the three dots next to a song and like view credits and see like songwriter
Only
credits. And
songwriter and producer. That's all they have. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So that is a really interesting point. Like, if there was more, it would be revealing about the origin of some of this
Hmm.
material. And yeah, no, I think it's a great point. And it kind of reminds me of like, I think one of the there's also this like dynamic in with streaming where I feel like it has contributed to, like we talked about earlier, I think a word that gets thrown around a lot is that streaming has contributed to the devaluing of music, like
Yeah.
not even just financially, but culturally. And I think that's something that is a really big risk is like, you know, streaming users just not having an understanding of how much labor goes into creating music, because they're unable to see, credits, for example. And
Hmm.
when you also have stuff like, I think it was a couple months ago, maybe you actually know the quote better than me, but Daniel X said something along the lines of like, you know,
The cost of creation music is virtually zero. Yeah.
yeah, the cost of creating music is zero, or the cost of content, maybe he said is zero. I'm not sure.
Right.
Um, like that's really harmful, I think, for music,
Hmm.
period. To have a situation where like not only is the are there these subtle turns in the interface that would potentially contribute to a user not being able to understand how much labor has gone into the creation of a recording, but also to have a CEO getting on a loud microphone pronouncing that the cost of making music is zero, which is
Right.
just couldn't be further from the truth. And I think
Hmm.
there's a quote towards the end of my book where I'm talking about this musicians union, or it's more of a solidarity group, United Musicians and Allied Workers, and this work that they've done with Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib's office on this bill called the Living Wage for Musicians Act. But I interviewed
Hmm.
someone from her office that says, one of the issues with streaming is that when a person streams a song, they're not just streaming a song, they're consuming someone's labor at a really artificially deflated price. And I thought that was such an interesting way of framing it, because that is what's happening. It's like
Hmm.
there's a lot of labor that goes into a song that gets really invisibilized in an environment that suggests that, it in some cases is valueless.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. And I did want to ask you about solutions kind of moving forward, like your recommendations. I mean, you talk about, like, you referenced the UMAW, and kind of how they worked with Congresswoman Tlaib to introduce the Living Wage for Musicians Act, which that was over a year ago, or about a year ago, I guess, now. And there really hasn't been much movement on that. And I don't foresee any movement on that, considering the lobbying power of Spotify and the major labels, because it wouldn't necessarily benefit them as well. But and is this like, would it take a congressional act? Would it take something like an act of Congress to really change the culture, like get the public to value music again, and to make a sustainable future for musicians? I like how you reference kind of, in Ireland they have a basic income for artists, and there's various grants in different countries that they offer, and the program that you talk about with like libraries, which also is really cool. And I loved learning about that. I had no idea about this program where libraries, uh, some of them will chronicle local music and prioritize that, and then license it directly from the artist for a couple $100 or something like that, which is great. But that's obviously not livable or sustainable, and that's not a way to make a living. But where do you see, where do we go from here as an industry, or as a public, and as a society, when it comes to music and sustainability and supporting artists?
Yeah, the book obviously ends with like a pretty like particular like uh, political perspective or vision that
Mm-hmm.
to me is just like important to sort of articulate a sort of constellation of um, things that I just feel like would contribute to a more like robust and radical reimagination of how we value music and art in society. So thinking
Sure.
about like public funding, like musicians co-ops, like these kind of really radical alternatives outside of the music business. Because in some ways, I feel like music is really unique in that with other artistic forms and like literary traditions, there's more of a like, for like books, for example, we think of more as a public good. Like we believe that there should be like universal access to these things through the public library. But especially in the United States, we don't necessarily really think of music in the same way. And music is like really left to the marketplace and to the corporate music industry in a way that I think is really actually really risky for music as an art form. It's been amazing starting to do events for the book and hearing other people's like questions and perspectives. And my event in DC, something that came up in the Q&A that we talked about was kind of how, part of what is so kind of concerning about the streaming environment is how we've really like entrusted this small handful of tech companies as these sort of stewards of the archive of the history of recorded music in a way that just kind of seems unsustainable. And not even just these small handful of tech companies, but like the corporate music business, period. And it just seems like, it's so important for there to be like forces and culture taking on that role of like archiving and thinking about what it means to be a responsible steward of an archive of music, like outside of the pressures of the business relationship. I don't know if that's like kind of abstract, but there is this sort of like I think our archival and historical consideration as well, and kind of why I think that some of these things around like public funding and libraries are so important. Um, anyway, sorry, that was like it's like a little bit of a tangent, but so I talk about that. I also try to take a sort of like multi-dimensional approach at the end of like laying out some things that could happen, one of which is, like I mentioned earlier, I talk about musicians unions and organizing projects, and I do think that like in other countries there are stronger labor movements, period, but there also
Yeah.
are like more robust musicians unions for independent musicians. And I do think that it's been really, whether you agree with the Living Wage for Musicians Act or the Justice at Spotify campaign or not, I feel like these solidarity organizations emerging for musicians, independent musicians, are so important, especially at a time where this idea of, the atomized indie content creator has really sort of like emerged as this new kind of like archetype of what it means to be independent, in a way that, is obviously empowering for a lot of people, but also can be incredibly like individualistic.
Yeah.
I think that it is really cool to see, different solidarity groups arising. Even for myself as a writer, as like a full-time freelance writer, seeing things like with the National Writers Union, there's this group called the Freelance Solidarity Project, and it's really powerful, I think, when you're like a individual freelancer, to have these like points of connection where you could have a collective voice, even just to kind of like, have resources for working through problems that you might be dealing with, or like to get people's perspectives on things, or to be able to, attempt like collectively negotiating with different clients or companies that you might work for or whatever.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I mean, I love that. And I would think we would all appreciate that, and you call them collectives because technically we're not actually allowed to join a union, independent musicians and artists. We can't join any unions. We technically have the American Federation of Musicians, the AFM, which is the only like real established legal union in the U.S., but that really only caters to classical musicians and people who play on like soundtracks and stuff like that, and theater musicians and play in the theater, and we're not allowed to join. And it's like because of the collective bargaining laws, and so I think you even referenced this like another law would have to change, and I forget which bill that was or the law would, but you're right. I mean, we there's a lot of preventative actions, which is like on one hand, I'm just like, yes, like let's justice for Spotify, like let's go and let's like join this movement and boycott or pick up, but we can't boycott, we can't collectively bargain, we can't really do this. So it's like on one hand it's like, yeah, let's go, and on the other hand it's like, man, what can we do here? Because it can feel deflating when there are so many forces that are against this kind of organizing and collective voice, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah, I call them like solidarity organizations,
Yeah.
because maybe unions. The bill that I mentioned, it's called the Protect Working Musicians Act, and it's a
Okay.
bill like on the table in Congress that would make an exception for musicians,
Hmm.
or it would like kind of like change the rules slightly so that musicians would be able to collectively bargain and organize, and it's I think really worth looking into. And
Yeah.
yeah, so like even though these solidarity organizations might not necessarily be able to directly organize a boycott currently or something like that, there is a lot of other stuff they're able to do. I mean, I like teach undergraduates in a music business program essentially also, and I'm always pointing them towards UMA because they have their other resources. Like one that might be interesting here is that they have a like record like labels working group that has sort of made this resource of just like redacted contracts that people can review if they want to see like samples of what other record contracts people have gotten from labels look like, and the stuff like that I think is like really helpful for people operating in this really like isolated DIY way to
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
um,
So.
yeah. So I talk about like labor stuff.
Hmm.
I interview Kevin Erickson from the Future of Music Coalition for a sort of antitrust perspective on some
Hmm.
of the stuff with digital payola and what it would look like for the FTC to use the power that it has to review the contracts between Spotify and the major record labels. I think that would be a really interesting first step towards maybe some sort of broader grappling with the
Yes.
power of major record labels.
Yes.
And that's certainly something that I think like could be explored even more than I get into in the book too. I referenced this study that came out a couple of years ago called Streaming in the Dark that was put out by this group called Public Knowledge in DC. It's kind of like a think tank, but it's a really good paper, and they land on a similar argument or proposal or suggestion for the FTC to like do this similar sort of intervention to review the contracts between streaming services and the major labels. So
Yeah.
I feel like that would be super interesting and meaningful as well.
Would love to see that. That would be so helpful. We talk about the leveling of the playing field, but it's impossible to level the playing field in this context when everything is in the dark. We are in the dark about all these contracts, these NDAs, and that we have no idea what playing field we're even on because everything is so secretive and it's locked up with these NDAs. Like I said, before, how I was frustrated to learn that a stream is not this. It's not equal. That we're not. At least if we were all, every musician and every label and every indie artist, we're all playing on the same field and we're all struggling through this together, that would be one thing. But when we don't even know what the majors are paid for streaming, and we just have to assume based on leaked documents or whatever, or comparing, people's individual statements, that they're getting paid more per stream than we are, that's like, that just shouldn't be like that. And I think the FTC I would love to see them step in, but we'll see. So anyway, I've taken up so much of your time, Liz. I appreciate you chatting with me, and it's an excellent book, and I encourage everybody to pick it up and read it. I have one final question that I ask everyone who comes on the show, and that is, what does it mean to you to make it in the new music business?
Yeah, it's super interesting, and I was thinking about it in advance because I remember, you said that this is a question that you always ask, and it's not really like a framework through which I like really think about um, uh, what I'm writing about, although I can understand like why it gets asked. I feel like there's part of me that feels like the concern with like how do I make it is kind of this like individualistic kind of question, whereas maybe like what I'm thinking about is like how do we create the like structural conditions so that the music business is less exploitative, um, but and less extractive. But that aside, like I mentioned, I also do work in a music business program. I just I teach a music journalism class, but I teach undergraduates, and these types of questions come up actually quite a lot. So I actually have sort of like thought about them, and I like maybe it sounds like kind of general, but I feel like there's two things. Like I feel like something that is really powerful about coming from a DIY background is that like one of the hallmarks of DIY culture is that we get to define success for ourselves. It means something different to everyone else, and
Yes.
something that I always kind of like tell my students is to just sort of like banish the ideas from your mind of what you think success is supposed to look like, or what the music business tells you it's supposed to look like. You
Yeah.
actually get to decide for yourself like what it would mean to have a meaningful or fulfilling relationship with your music practice.
Yeah.
So I think that if you can like get to a point where you figure out what that means to you, like that is cool. And then I also always say that like there are so many forces in the music business that are
Mhm.
trying to sort of like stomp out your like willingness or interest in continuing to do this, that like, or your like love of music. So to some extent, it's like if you can like keep alive like your willingness to, or your interest in wanting to pursue an artistic impulse and make music and share with people, and play shows and be part of a music community, keep up with new music, like that I think is incredibly successful.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Liz, thank you so much. That was great. Today's episode was edited by Ari Davids, with music by Grassroots District, and produced by all the great people at Ari's Take.